Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast, and I'm Nachi Weinstein. This week, we take a short break from the 10 Lost Tribes series, which will return next week. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Mosaic Press. Check out their many new titles, including Halachah Matters by Rabbi Zvi Nachman, which presents true-to-life, modern-day halachic dilemmas that are as relevant as they are entertaining. For each example, a halachic analysis follows, continuing with a conclusion and further questions that provide an ideal springboard for meaningful conversation, ideal for the Shabbos table or classroom discussion. Get your copy now at mosaicapress.com and use the code CHATTER, CHATTER, for an exclusive 15% off. And you can also get a copy in your local Judaica store. To sponsor an episode or support the podcast, please email me at svarimchatter@gmail.com or see the links and information in the show's notes. Additionally, please check out the brand new Svarim Chatter YouTube channel. There is now a teaser video up, and there will be a video tour of part of my library, which will be going up tonight, February 18th, the day this is airing. Please subscribe and share the YouTube channel. And if you have more ideas of what you would like to see in the video format, please comment on YouTube or email me. Also, there's the Svarim Chatter Substack. You can find the link to that in the show's notes as well. And you can please subscribe. For those that aren't familiar, that's like a blog and it gets emailed to you. Also, there's a link in the show's notes for the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where there is an admin-only chat where I post new books, Svarim, and other information. And there is also a podcast discussion-related chat. And finally, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, especially on Apple. And enjoy this episode, and check out the link in the show's notes to purchase the book discussed on the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Michoel Rotenfeld, who is the Associate Director of Touro University Libraries, and he is the editor and translator of the new Volume 1 of the Shochet, a memoir of Jewish life in Ukraine and Crimea by Pinkhes-Dov Goldenshteyn. And this is translated from the Yiddish with, as I said, he's an editor, but there's a lengthy, 150 plus page introduction in here as well. Maybe it's a little less, but it's a very large introduction, less than that, very large introduction with extensive notes. And again, this is Volume 1, with Volume 2 is forthcoming. So we'll be discussing the autobiography, which is fascinating, full of really vivid, descriptive detail of the life of this Pinkhes-Dov Goldenshteyn. So thank you, Rabbi Rotenfeld, for joining me. Now, let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
I learned in Lubavitcher yeshivas in Kfar Chabad in Morristown, New Jersey, and I have a master's degree in information library science. I'm the associate director, as you mentioned, I'm the associate director of libraries at Touro University. So,
this is an interesting thing. It's an autobiography of, it's called the Shochet because he was a Shochet, as we'll get to. And this is really his life in the, we're talking about latter part of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, of someone. This volume covers his life in Ukraine, and he travels to Crimea, and then he's going to go to Eretz Yisrael, and that's going to be Volume 2. This is just the first part. But how did you get to this book that was written in Yiddish, this autobiography? How did you get here and this whole project come to be?
Okay, I've been interested in Jewish autobiography for years and years. I'm particularly fond of autobiographies written in Yiddish, the language in which the events originally occurred. So keep in mind, though, that in the 1920s and 30s in America, Yiddish was the Jewish publishing language. Hundreds and hundreds of books were published each year. At that time, it was even difficult to sell Jewish books in America which weren't printed in Yiddish, such as Hebrew or English. So, how did I come to this book, Pinkhes-Dov Goldenshteyn's Zichrenes? So, when I was learning in yeshiva in Kfar Chabad, I was there in 1988. I wanted to know more about a certain historical matter. So I asked around, and I was told I should contact Yeshua Monsheim, Olav Shalom. He was this brilliant Hasidic researcher. So I called him up in Yerushalayim, And I asked him my question. And he told me he had just written a chapter about the very subject I was looking into in Kerem Chabad, which was a 3-volume work. So I bought that. It was printed in Kwar Chabad. And I noticed an article about Pinkhes-Dov Goldenshteyn's autobiography. First of all, I just want to mention one thing, that those names, Pinkhes-Dov, he was called Pinye-Ber. Pinye is a nickname for Pinkhes, and Ber is a nickname for Dov. They both mean bear. In Europe, the names Dov, Zvi, and Zev were not used on a daily basis. They were only used for religious purpose, aliyah l'Torah, something like that. But on a day-to-day basis, their Yiddish equivalents were used. So I always referred to him as Pinye-Ber. In any case, so I read this article, and which summarized the book and brought out the points he was particularly interested in. Anyway, then it took me another few years before I was able to lay my hands on the original copy. And I saw right away it was very different from the others that I had read.
What made it different specifically?
Well, first of all, most 19th century autobiographies, Jewish autobiographies, are written by maskilim. They're not frum. In fact, their whole story is about how they grew up in the darkness of Yiddishkeit, so to speak, in the horrible cheder, and broke away, saw the light of the Haskalah, and his, there are some from autobiographies, but they're certainly not as captivating this, and certainly he describes, whenever Pinye-Ber, this Goldenshteyn, whenever he describes anything, he describes in great detail, great granular detail, so you really get a feeling for daily life. So when a Rav writes about his life, you learn about his pulas, his accomplishments, but you don't learn about daily life. But with Pinye-Ber, you really learned how people lived.
Yeah, and as I mentioned in the beginning, it's very graphic, really, in the good way. It really is descriptive. He had a real talent for that. It's you titled it the Shochet, and he was a Shochet, but it's almost the storyteller, because he's such a terrific storyteller, and it's so descriptive. It really gives us a picture in like full color almost of the time period that he's talking about. So, as you said, you became familiar with this book, you read it. How did you come to this project of translating and annotating and writing? So I mentioned the introduction. It's too big. It's like 70 pages, but it's still pretty big. How did you come to write this introduction with this heavily annotated and translated edition?
Okay. So shortly after I obtained a copy of it, and I read it a few times, so I wanted to know if there was more to Pinye-Ber's story. So I tracked down a granddaughter of his. He still had 2 granddaughters alive who knew him in Eretz Yisrael. And she was thrilled to hear from me. So she also put me in touch with her relatives in America. So I didn't know it, but one of them had been looking for a translator. I had not contacted them because I was interested in translating it. So I was very hesitant to undertake such an enormous task. I wasn't sure I was up to it. But good friends convinced me that I was the person for the project. And that's how it began. Why such a lengthy introduction? Well, right away I showed it to friends, and they said, "No frum publisher's going to touch it. He's too unfiltered. He does not portray this idealized version of the shtetl. He shows corruption." And so I decided to do an academic translation. If you're doing an academic translation, then it has to have introduction. So that was 2.5 years of my life.
Wow. And
it was one of the hardest things I've ever written.
It's really in-depth, the introduction, and your notes also, as we'll talk about your notes and the introduction. But I think we can leave all that, your notes and the introduction and all the kind of nitty-gritty stuff towards the end, and we can get into the book itself and into Pinye-Ber and talking about him and why it's such a wonderful book. and a pleasure to read. And like you say, it really gives a kind of a boots on the ground portrayal, if you will, like a portrayal of someone that lived at the time in the shtetl in the late 19th century. So let's talk about him first and his story, his biography, whether that comes from here or other places. Where was he from? When was he born? Starting with that.
Well, first, I just want to say that some of your readers might enjoy the book starting at chapter 4. The first 3 chapters, he talks about his family background. I really enjoy them. A lot of readers find it much more engaging. Chapter 4, where he starts with his own life. Okay, that said, let's talk about him. Pinye-Ber was born in 1848 in Tiraspol. Tiraspol was in the former Tsarist Russian province of Kherson in Ukraine. Now Tiraspol is part of Moldova on the border of Ukraine. And in the course of his youth and he was in dozens of towns and villages, all in that entire area, including in eastern Romania. He was the youngest of 6 children who lived to adulthood. He was born to a father who was a poor Malamed. His mother ran a store, and she had to go every 2 weeks out of town to fairs. He came from a very learned family. His father, his grandfathers, they were Lamdonim. He was related to the Rav of Tiraspol. And as both his parents died by the time he was 7. So then he went to live with his only brother, who was a big Lamdin. But after a year, his brother died. And so many members of his family died young. So many of his sisters. And meanwhile, he was left with his sisters, who barely had enough money to feed themselves, let alone feed him and send him to Cheder, pay for a Malamed. So that now started the whole process of sending him to this relative and that relative. But Pinye-Ber, he didn't like being abused, and he was rambunctious, maybe because he didn't have parents. So he's a little wild. And so either he was sent back to his sisters, or sometimes he ran back. Their poverty was striking. In this book, though, certainly he has a sense of humor, but it's one, I would say it's probably the hardest 19th century Jewish autobiography to read. At times, it's heartbreaking.
I mean, as you say, just in the beginning, when he talks about chapter 1, my parents, and he talks about his parents, and he talks about his father being a Malamed, and he talks about the hardship that they went through, and the poverty, and them dying. I mean, it's like I said, it's really sad to read that.
Yes, and then the sad part is, such a significant percentage of the Jewish people live that way then, which probably people don't really realize.
Yeah, I mean, he talks, he ends off this chapter, he talks about, in the first one, he says, they suffered in this world as much as if they had lived to be twice their age. And he says, but who can ask God, what are you doing? God certainly knows what he's doing, for he is always right. Everyone in town took his death to heart, and he talks about it, but he really sees Emunah anyways, but he talks about it. And before, I'm going back a little bit, he talks about the poverty of the Grosseler Malamed grew from day to day. Their children grew up, and the family continued to increase with the birth of each newborn that God bestowed upon them. But the Grosseler Malamed and Esther Chaya, the Grosseler,
right, that's his parents.
Yeah, it is his parents. I'm just reading. Those are his parents. Worked extremely hard day and night, yet barely earned enough to buy dry bread. I mean, he's talking about the extreme poverty that they had. And then chapter 2 really talks about the death of his parents, brother-in-law's brother, really going through everything, and how he ended up orphaned, really, and at the time.
Yes.
So, that's really in the beginning, as you say. It's really, sad, the first few chapters. It's not only that people want to read about him, it's really, it starts off real down note to start this book before it gets into him. But let's talk about him and his early childhood. I guess we kind of said his kind of biography. I guess we'll bounce around and talk about him with the book in different parts. And then he goes into his early childhood and what it was like for him growing up.
Right. So he speaks a lot about his Cheder years and his all his many different Malamdim. Some were cruel, some were very dedicated to him. You know,
you know, I want
he
to.
talks about every aspect. He talks about the games they played, the punishments he received, running away from school.
I want to just start off at the beginning, just to say when he talks about his early childhood, what's interesting is, first of all, he talks about himself in third person, right in the beginning, and he says, now we'll speak about the youngest child, Berila, who unfortunately never had a good day since the day he was born. His impoverished parents, who were so encumbered with children and were barely able to feed themselves, were nonetheless happy with the birth and survival of an additional child, Berila. After all, poor people's greatest pleasure is their children. May they all live and be well. Nonetheless, the child born to the poor does not have as much pleasure as the parents, as in the case of our Berila. If he had been lucky, he would have been born to rich parents. Having no luck, he was born to poor parents, surrounded by naked, barefoot siblings, large and small. And he continues on. And skipping his, more than once was his life miraculously saved by being pulled out from under the overturned cradle and all the rags used as his bedding just before suffocating. And he just goes on and on. I mean, it's really descriptive, and it's also sad to read it. But he continues. In addition, his father was a Malamed after all. It's almost like a dry humor, though, as he's writing in this sadness.
There's a lot of dry humor there.
Yeah, you really read it, and he says, just as Berila would fall asleep, his father's students would begin a heated discussion of their Torah lessons and would begin debating and shouting loudly. Berila would awake, and in the matter of babies who do not sleep their full, would begin crying. Father would then scream, take him away to his mother. He's not falling asleep. He keeps screaming, I can't study with the children. He keep going on. He talks about it. He's going to his mother in the store, and he says the Sultan would come, and someone would come in and wait, take him away from his mother. And so he really brings in that dry humor. But he also is giving a sense of what it's like to be a child of a Malamed with other children in, Ukraine at the time, and what life was like there.
Right. But by the way, he's talking about Ukraine, but life in the whole, and then he visits Romania and then Belarus. But life in all of Tsarist Russia and which included Lithuania and Poland, and all of it had a certain common thread, certain similarities. Meaning, much of what he wrote could have been said about anywhere in the Tsarist Empire. I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are certain cultural differences between one area and another.
Right. Another thing he mentions, just, and I'll just keep reading, and I'm sure you'll say stories, but just to give a sampling, he says, my mother, I barely remember her. Her appearance is hidden from me, though I often remember something that I will never forget. Once when I returned from Cheder, she gave me her portion of milk, saying, the child is tired from studying and weak from toiling all day in Cheder. And she, these stories that we hear all the time, this is someone saying firsthand account that his mother just gave him what she had once he came home from Cheder. And he talks about his father.
Right, so he's talking about his mother's compassion. And he was a very compassionate person. So that's his earliest earliest remembrance of his mother, this act of compassion.
Now, something about his father, he says he was handsome with a broad blonde beard. He used to shave his head and had long curly payas and would wear a kapota that reached the ground. So I think it's important. I don't think we mentioned that they were Hasidim, and we should talk about that.
His father was a Ber Shele Chosin. Ber Shele Rebbe did not have children who became rabbis. So, but the Chassidus lasted a little. One of the few Chassidus who lasted a little while, even after the Rebbe was nifter. But in that whole area, most everyone was Chassidish. He discusses all the different rabbis in the area, and his problems with the Chassidim in that area.
And Pinye-Ber himself, we'll just jump ahead to later on in his life. He was a chassid. What type was he?
He became a Lubavitcher. There were some, not many, there were some Chabadniks in that area. And his brother had married, his brother's brother-in-law was a Chabadnik. And the Rav of that shtetl where his sister-in-law's family was from was a Lubavitcher, and he had been a chassid of the Alter Rebbe, the Balatanya. So that greatly, he was greatly impressed by the few Lubavitchers he met. And at one point in his life, we can talk about it a little later, he decided to make the long trip, mostly on foot, over 500 miles to Lubavitch.
Yeah, we can talk about him visiting a Rebbe's later. But then, so let's jump ahead. So he goes to Cheder, and he gives a description, as you said before, some of the really just the descriptions in here. He says, talking about one of his malamed, at my new malamed, where he says he suffered a lot. He says he was 8 years old, and he was there because he was an unruly child, and that malamed was very strict. He says the malamed was called Rav David Malamed. And he said he was told to beat me for everything and anything, and he naturally followed the order. I was beaten for the slightest of gestures. By nature, I was happy. If I chuckled or simply had a happy expression on my face, I would earn a blow of the strap across my face or back. It made no difference where the strap struck, as long as it hit me well. But he says I was never beaten on account of my learning, because I knew the sections of Talmud and the Chumash with Rashi's commentary as soon as I reviewed them once on Monday.
Yeah,
so I was left with nothing to do all week except to listen to others reviewing it. So he says, he copped exactly what was going on. He knew what was going on, and then he just got beaten. So he's really giving you a description of what it was like in this
out of his mind, because these people, what he knew on Sunday, the first day, they didn't know by Thursday when they were supposed to be tested. So, of course, he acted up.
Yeah, so who was he living with? So once his parents die, his mother and then his father, how old is he? And then where does he live?
Okay, he's 7 when his father passed away. Then they sent him off to his brother in Grosseles. And then his brother died after a year. And then he came back to Tiraspol. And he was by various different relatives. And then one was very strict. And then they sent him off to his grandfather. Not in Grosseles. By the way, his brother wasn't in Grosseles, somewhere else, Romanovke. But then they sent him back to his grandfather in Grosseles. I'll tell you an incident what happened with his grandfather. So his grandfather was very old and he was hard of hearing. So his grandfather would learn with him or test him in Gemara, and then the grandfather would look at the movement of his hands to know if he knew the Gemara properly. So every time because he couldn't, and Pinye-Ber shouting, so every time Pinye-Ber didn't move his hands properly, he'd get slapped. So seeing he was getting a raw deal, Pinye-Ber, he'd hide the shank of his grandfather's pipe. So then his grandfather would spend most of the time looking for it. Then the grandfather realized that Pinye-Ber had been hiding it, so he'd lock up a pipe shank, so they could learn. But then Pinye-Ber would wriggle out of him anyway. Once the grandfather chased him in the street, pleading with neighbors, catch him. They gave him a good chase. He gave them a good chase, but once he was caught, then he'd kick and he'd throw street dust in their eyes. As Pinye-Ber writes, he was having the time of his life. But finally his grandparents had enough, and they sent him back to his sisters in Tiraspol. So he was again in Tiraspol. And then again they had to wonder, what are they going to do with it?
There's so many stories in here, and another one that's really sad. I don't want to keep going on a sad theme, but it kind of comes up, especially in the beginning, is that he had some issues, and so he ended up going to the cemetery, trying to go to the cemetery to visit his parents' kvarim. And what?
It's a heartbreaking story.
It's heartbreaking, really. That's why I think it's worth repeating. They didn't, I'll skip the part where they didn't want to let him in. They said it's not a place for a boy, for a child. Long story short, he gets into the cemetery, and that's where I'll pick up. He goes into the cemetery, and he says, when I found my father's grave and began to weep out loud, all of them, from the youngest to oldest, sobbed along with me, shedding bitter tears. My contention was that since my life was so very bad, my father should take me to be with him. Things would be good for me with him. I would not be an orphan, no one would beat me, and no one would rule over me. I slowly lowered my head onto the gravestone and fell asleep out of weakness and hunger, not having eaten in almost 24 hours. Seeing my condition, they took me into their home, fed me bread and milk, and I became revitalized. I felt unburdened, as if a heavy stone had been lifted up from upon my heart. Tears, it seems, are heavy. Then he talks about the grave digger. And obviously, I'm jumping around out of context there a little bit. There's with other people, but it's a terrible story to think about an orphan, and this is what's happening to him. It's really very moving, and he talks about afterwards how he ends up back by his sister, and he goes back to his sister. And then the next part is when he goes with his grandfather, which is what you were saying before with the pipe, and he ends up with the grandfather. So I mean, really, it's just, and he really relays over and over all the stories in exact detail of what happened to him. And then he continues on that he ends up being moved around. So I think we could talk about his moving around, and also something that's famous, I would say very famous, is the Cantonists, the Chappers, as he calls them, that they would come at the time in Russia, and the terrible decree to take the Jewish children and put them in the Tsar's army. And this is something that plays a role in his life and in his autobiography.
Yes, it does. First, I just would like to say part of the uniqueness of his autobiography is he's so open with his emotions. He'll express it with his emotions. So in the Maskilic autobiographies of that period, they're very unrevealing, remarkably so, of their inner life. And Pinye-Ber shares it so readily that, every reader would feel connected with him. In any case, let's get back to the Cantonists. So the Cantonists were, because of it was a Tsar's decree that Jews had to fulfill large quotas. I think it started 1827, and in order to meet those quotas, eventually they started kidnapping children. So the children were seized by chappers, and then they would be sent to non-Jewish homes, like till the age of 18. And then once they're 18, they would start their 25 years of service, military service. So this was the Tsar's attempt at alleviating the Jewish problem he figured most would convert and assimilate by that at the end of those many years, which I don't think he was very successful. In any case, so Pinye-Ber's in shul, Rosh Hashanah, and he's davening, and all of a sudden he understands that there's a whole pack of chappers come and tried to capture children all over the shul. And his sister quickly made her way to him, grabbed him, had him crouch underneath her dress, underneath her, and she walked slowly and made sure he walked with her. And that way she left shul without people realizing where he was. And people were amazed how he was not caught. But even afterwards, he had to live in weeks in an attic alone in the dark, in hiding, because they were looking for him. They knew he existed, and they're looking for him. He's like a perfect person, a yosim, an orphan, where they preyed on orphans. They had no one to come to their defense. And he meets another time. He had to hide a few times from Cantonists. Eventually, they thought that there was going to be another raid by chappers, so they sent him off to his sister sent him off to their aunt, who they had never met, in Chichelnik, which was quite a distance. By the time he arrived, official word was given that the Cantonist decree had ended. But meanwhile, he was in this faraway place, so he was stuck there for a bit. In general, he had to hide out because he was not registered. His birth was not registered, so so that played a large role in his life, not having documents. Many Jews didn't register because they were afraid of conscription, afraid of all sorts of things, and rightfully so. But it led to great hardship on his part.
Now let's talk about him going to yeshiva. He goes to yeshiva in Odessa. He learns, and I want to ask you a general question also, that how common or how uncommon is it for he's an orphan, as we said, and he runs around from the chappers, from the Cantonists. He ends up bouncing around. And by the way, we're being very general and glossing over. There's chapters and chapters where he goes through in his, vivid description of his life and going to different towns, different places he's staying, and different stories and anecdotes. And you can always feel free to jump in and relate any. But he ends up in yeshiva. And before we even get to him going to yeshiva, how rare is it for an orphan, someone to end up in this situation? I mean, you mentioned how poor he is and how terrible his life is. How does he get to yeshiva? Is that a common thing?
Common. Well,
the word might not be common, but how surprising is it?
What happened to him was his sisters didn't know what to do with him, so they sent him to a relative of theirs, and he promised to give him, to give him a chinuch, to hire a rabbi to teach him, but he didn't, and he became a house mishoras, a house servant to this person, to this relative. So he worked him horribly hard. I'm doing everything, and then he was there about 2.5 years, and then suddenly, after like 2.5 years of slaving away, he picked up a Gemara. He would daven, he would like tefillin, obviously. He picked up the Gemara, and he could, at once he knew it well, and he didn't know it at all. And he comes from a family of learners, and this sparked within him this huge yearning to connect, to learning again, to maintain this vital connection. And he started planning his getaway. And one day he found opportunity and he ran off. And he went to a nearby town and he sat in the Beis Medrash, and someone said, who are you? And he told him, and he said, and they started learning Chumash et Rashi in a good head, and he caught on quickly. And then he heard about that there was a Talmud Torah in Odessa for poor children. Now, today, people use the Talmud Torah to mean a whole variety of things, a cheder. But in Europe, a Talmud Torah meant a communal institution for poor children. It didn't mean stam a cheder. It was different than a cheder. So once in the Beis Medrash there, they heard he wanted to go, so they raised some money, and he made his way there. And it's a whole story how he got admitted. They didn't want to admit him because they thought he didn't know anybody. He's an orphan. But he managed to get in, and he had great rabbis there, and he learned a lot. But again, he was unregistered, and he had to go. They would start checking the students in the Talmud Torah. So he had to go again into hiding. How common was it for poor children? Once you get into yeshiva gedola, it was very common. People to come without anything. But for that age, it was rare. Usually they'd be working by his age from a poorer family. But he had that experience, and he forgot his learning, and he very much wanted to. He understood the vitality of limud Torah.
Now, how long did he learn in yeshiva? I mean, did he ends up
in that Talmud Torah? So he only learned twice. So he learned there for a few months, and then he had to go into hiding, and then later, after he became a chosin, I think he became a chosin at 16. He decided he was very impressed with the Lubavitchers he met, and he decided to go to Lubavitch and ask the Rebbe where to learn, and ask for a bracha for Riches Yomim, since most of the members in his family died young. The bracha worked. He lived into his 80s. The Tzemach Tzedek advised him to learn in Shklov, which was not far from Lubavitch. This is in Belarus. And he went, but also he only was there a few months before an issue came up with his internal passport. So his formal education was limited, but useful to him. He could learn. He could, he could learn, and he did learn.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask generally, just taking a step back of this specific time period, and we're going to get to his engagement at 16 in 1864, 65 in a second, but just taking a step back of him even later on in life. So he was able to learn, but he was like, what was his...
I mean, if he would have stayed in Shklov for the 3 years he wanted until his chasana, certainly he could have, become a much bigger, Talmid Chacham. But nonetheless, he was in Shklov. He became very close to the Rosh Yeshiva. The Rosh Yeshiva was his favorite Talmud. He would learn with him extra at night and all other times. He saw how devoted he was in his Hasmada, and he kept up his learning throughout his life.
Right. So let's go to his engagement, which is a really I don't know the word like the story, but his description of the story is a very interesting description of what happened. So they find him, he's sleeping, it's after Yom Kippur, and they wake him up and say, "Wake up, sleepyhead, we're all waiting for you. This is what," I'm like paraphrasing here. "What's going on?" He said, "Get up quickly, come down." And he went downstairs and he sees all different people there, they're cheery, they're happy. What's going on? They said, "Go get dressed, wash up, and go." And he said, "What's going on?" They said, you keep going. They keep pushing him off. They're not telling him what's going on. Right. And they said he was sleeping by an oven. They said he was sleeping by an oven. They couldn't wake him up. It was warm. Anyways, they bring him, and he gets there, and he gets to the Rav's house, and he finds a crowd of 60 to 70 men, not including the woman. And he said, all were already under the influence. When they saw me, a sudden shout went up. "He's here at last, the handsome groom. Look how he waited to be asked to come while such a large crowd kind of horror was waiting him. Some defended me while others blamed me. Out of respect for the local rabbi, he shouldn't have delayed so long and waited for others to ask him to come. They grasped me and placed him next to the rabbi of Shloimeh." And he says he was looking around, what's going on? He sees different people were there. I'm skipping around. And he says that the chazan was there. He says the crowd was well imbibed and the table was laden with wine. I knew that after Yom Kippur people drank at the rabbis, but I never expected they were about to write an engagement contract with me. And he says, "Hand over an ink and a pen," said the cantor, the chazan. "I wonder why I need ink and a pen all of a sudden, but I soon knew it all. I soon knew all." And he said, suddenly, Reb Shulam, who had been speaking the entire time with Reb Itzia, while his wife Devorah stood nearby, suddenly addressed me. Pinkhes-Dov, you're now becoming engaged, and we're about to write the engagement contract." "How's that possible?" I said. "What does it mean that I'm becoming engaged? How can you write an engagement contract when I don't have the slightest idea with whom? Who's my father-in-law?" And this is all these people are drunk over there. They're all drinking away, and they just dragged him out. No one wanted to tell him anything. It's really amazing when you read this. And he says, Shulam said, "Yes, you're right about that. You need to know everything. So you should know that all of your friends are in agreement. All of your friends, they're marrying him off. They're in agreement that you should become engaged to Reb Itzia's daughter. You know Reb Itzia and his wife well, and you know his daughter too. And if it's agreeable with all of us, must be agreeable with you as well." They're telling him what to do. He said, and everyone gave their consent. And they knew he was an honest and virtuous Jew, and he was making a sacrifice to obtain a Torah scholar such as myself, as my son, as a son-in-law, despite my poverty. They wanted to make him happy, and they give a whole thing, and they're going to promise him 300 ruble in cash, which we'll get up to. There's a problem with that money, and all these different things, what he's going to do. And he says, but what's also really, he describes, he said he was torn. He couldn't decide what to do because he never expected such a sudden development. He said all his relatives thought it was a fitting match, but what did they have to lose? Right. But he said, this was such a sudden development for me. I pictured before me Reb Itzia's coarse house, the silly village girl, the shameful nickname soldier, which Reb Itzia was called, and many others issues. If I were to get a belief, would they let me? Could I possibly contradict all the others, especially since they were all on my side and meant well for me? So I really have to stop and turn it over to what's going on really as we see Pinye-Ber's internal struggle here with what he should do. He's surprised, he's awakened, he's thrown into this. Everyone's drinking, they're marrying him off. His Kala's father, they're called soldier. It's kind of a derogatory name. He was served in the army. So yeah, let's talk about what's going on.
So that was a disgrace, right? Right.
Yes, and go ahead.
No. So yeah, and this was all arranged by his relative Shulam because he felt guilty how he treated him when he was a house servant. So he decided to do him the great favor of finding somebody. He found somebody, supposedly a wealthy couple who Pinye-Ber knew, who would support him with eternal caste, meaning support him with room and board so he could learn. But unfortunately, right after the engagement, he did agree. His future in-laws lost their money. And that dream was out the window.
Which is very unfortunate. So he ends up married to someone he didn't want to, essentially, in the beginning.
Well,
And
then he has this whole debate. First of all, she was 13, so they weren't getting married right away anyway. They were at least waiting 2 years, and they waited longer. But he had this whole debate, because here, his in-laws didn't have money like it was stipulated in the Tanoim, and so officially he could have broken it, but then he had pity on the Kala, like she'd never get a learner again. Who knows if she'd be able to marry? Her parents didn't have money. You needed a dowry. And he went to a Rebbe, I think he went to I think he went to the Stefan Ester. He asked, and the Stefan Ester says, don't look at yichus or money, look, stay engaged. It will work out. And because he became very eligible. He had a good head. He was a learner. He could have gotten a wealthy, learned father-in-law. And his father-in-law was not learned at all. He was a soldier, as you mentioned. So, but he listened to the Rebbe, and he kept it. He kept it. He kept it. But he decided to go off, and he wanted, at least he's not marrying right away, let him go off and learn. So that's when he went to Lubavitch. Most of the way by foot, a lot of the way by foot, and he talks about his whole journey there, how he had to raise money, to go to wagons for food all along the way. He tells you, he brings you along for his whole journey, whole difficult journey. And he arrives at Tzemach Tzedek, and he thought he would be able to learn in Shklov for a good 3 years, and it didn't work out that way because problems with his passport.
Yeah, he really talks about him traveling when he first gets the passport, then he travels, and he says he was among the Chabadniks, and he decided to go to see the Rebbe. This is where, he really relays exactly what we're really skipping over. All the time he's going back and forth into Tiraspol and other cities before this, he's going back and forth, and his sister, and this is sibling, and that sibling is going here, he's going there, he's relaying the whole story back and forth. There's like a lot of different, very granular details, if you will, in this autobiography. It's not the type of story or the autobiography that paints in broad strokes. He really gives you, the little specifics. You really get, mired in these small, in a good way. You really get bogged down by that. He really gives you the exact little stories that happen. Eventually, the tale moves forward. It moves along slowly, but it's really this general, broad kind of thing. Sorry, not this general broad thing. It's it's not like that. It's really very, very, very specific. And so we're doing it like the general thing here, and you really have to read it to really get that flavor and that feel of what he's doing.
It's amazing that way. You don't have other books like that.
No, not many autobiographies at all.
Right.
That are like this.
Right.
Then he talks about the Lubavitcher Rebbe and going to Shklov, and he meets with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and that's a story
and then,
here.
It's almost like he sees that the Tzemach Tzedeks and the Chassidim are very learned, and it's almost too good to be true. Is it really that way? Because he was not impressed with the Rebbes that he saw in the area where he was from. The Rebbes, maybe the Chassidim, maybe, I don't know how many Rebbes he said. So he decides to spy on that Tzemach Tzedek. And he does. He spies on him through a keyhole. And he sees he's sitting and learning. And there's no pomp. The Tzemach Tzedek, he needs something. He needs to wash his hands. He gives a bang with a stick. And the shamus comes in, and he washes his hand. He gives another bang. And then, it's everything but pashtus, and he loves it. He wanted a very serious Rebbe, and he had found.
Right after this, he ends up by the Liever Rebbe, Liever, if I'm pronouncing it right. And I know there's some controversy around him, but that's not for this book, for this conversation. And he goes there and delivers an esrog. That's the point of the story, if you want to relay that story and what happens there.
Okay, well, so he had to I think that's when he was being sent back to Romania by the Russian government, if I'm not mistaken. I could be mistaken. He went back to Romania a few times. Anyway, he has to go back to Romania. So there's some Lever Chassidim at the border asking all around, is someone going to across the border? Because they didn't have an external passport to cross the border. And they had bought an expensive esrig for the Rebbe, and it was Erev Sukkot. So he says, I'm going. So they go, hooray, and they're dancing, and they're thrilled. So they give, here's a very expensive esrig for the Rebbe, and bring it over the border, bring it right to the Rebbe. We're going to arrange that wagon will pick you up. Meanwhile, so he crosses the border, but there's a huge storm that night. Huge. And finally he gets across the border, and there's Chassidim with a wagon waiting for him on the other side. Are you Pinye-Ber? Yes, we're Pinye-Ber. Yeah. They're exciting. They were the ones who started dancing in the street. So they get in the coach to go back to Leave, and then these three Chassidim, they had paid for the schus of picking up the esrig at the border. So they said, okay, they said, let's see the esrig. They go, no, I didn't open it to look at it myself. This is for the Rebbe. We're not opening it. And Pinye-Ber, you should know, was a big person, physically. So, it's not, he was nobody to mess with. So they said, look, I paid, 30 rubles for this chus, and I can't even bring nobody had been in to see the Lever Rebbe for 2 years. So it was a very big chus to be able to do this. And, the guy says, I paid, Pinye-Ber says, I don't care. You paid for it. That's your business. You could have just sent a wagon to the border. But they asked me to bring it, and I'm bringing it to the Rebbe. And so he struggled a whole night with this person. Finally, he gets off the wagon. The guy again tries to, they arrive in Levi. The whole town comes out. Oh, the esrig came. The esrig, everybody's out on their porches in the street. You'd think it was, and so he comes out. And again, this fellow, he tries to take away the esrig. And so Pinye-Ber works the crowd. He says, is it right? He makes a whole appeal to the crowd. Is it right? I was the one who brought it. Is it right that he should bring it into the Rebbe? And they go, no, whatever. He worked the crowd. And he went in, and he was the first one to privately see the Rebbe in 2 years. And the Rebbe benched him. He thought it was a fabulous esrig. And he says, if you need anything else, come to me. He also asked for a bracha for Riches Yomi. He goes, you know what? Come, go to my doctor. This doctor checked him over, and he said it was okay.
Something else that comes up here is the ad b'chlal, ad v'le b'chlal. Up until is it you go when you say until something? When he was to get married, the Tzemach Tzedek or Mendel Lubavitch calls him and told him to get married at 20. So is it until 20 or including 20 or before?
Right,
19 or 20.
So the Tzemach Tzedek told him don't get married. When he went and asked for bracha for Riches Yomim, the Tzemach Tzedek said don't get married till the age of 20. That will be how you will have a Riches Yomim. And he goes, what? I'm already engaged. Tzemach Tzedek said, you heard me. Don't marry till 20. So then he goes to Shklov, he leaves Lubavitch, he leaves Shklov, he goes back, then he starts thinking. First of all, he's embarrassed to be without a talis. He's such a big guy and he has a big beard, and he's the alter bocher. And he's embarrassed not to wear a talis, not to be married. And meanwhile, the Rebbe told him not to marry till he's 20. So then he starts thinking, did the Rebbe mean till I ad beklal, meaning till I mamish till 20, or to the beginning of my 20th year, which means when he turns 19, which is the beginning of his 20th year. So he has that question. So he decides to ask 3 rabbis that question. and he goes to three different rabbis. He goes to the Tzemach Tzedek's son Baruch Shalom, who Lubavitch Rebbe was einikel from him. He came to Romania, so he visits him, and the Lever and was it the Stefan Eshter, and he received the same answer from all three, that no, the Rebbe only meant when he turned a day, right after the day after he turns 19. And Taka, that's when he got married, a few days after he turned 19.
Yeah, and he has some interesting, there's descriptions there as well. He talks about, so I think the Tzemach Tzedek was nifter at this time, right? So he talks about...
Right, so he couldn't go and ask the Tzemach Tzedek, because I forgot to say that, because the Tzemach Tzedek had passed away shortly after he saw him.
Yeah, so he talks about the Baruch Shalom of the son, and he talks about how he had a deformed... it's interesting how he says it. He goes, like, why would this matter? Baruch Shalom had a deformed hand, but was a tremendous Torah genius. He talks about him, and you're right, you talk about this in the notes, and he talks about Baruch Shalom, he talks about going to him, and then the next part he talks about the Stefan Eshter, and he goes to him as well. He asks him the same shaila. So there I want to read a little bit of the description there with the Hasidim there, because well, listen, there's so much in here. I'm cherry picking things here and there. It's a really wonderful book. And
read the parts you like. Yeah.
If I haven't said for the listeners, there'll be a link in the show's notes where you can purchase it. It's like $29 from. I'll check it up. 25, even cheaper, and it's on Amazon. It's on Prime. You can get it. I know it's the Judaica Plaza Liquid Head copy, so it's available. It's around. But yes, you should read the book. But anyways, he goes on. He goes to the Stefan Eshter. He said he agrees that up to but not including, that is, I may marry a few days after beginning my 20th year. And he also wished him a good life. He says, I like the Rebbe very much, but I did not like the Hasidim at his court. I had a major debate with them, and the Rebbe heard about it and sided with me. This is what happened. On the seventh day of Pesach, the Hasidim became so drunk that very early that morning, they went off singing to the bathhouse and immersed themselves in the mikveh fully dressed. They were mamish drunk. He says, they threw each other into the mikveh and as a result transgressed a number of Jewish laws, such as the prohibition of squeezing water from one's clothing and Yom Tov and the like. Furthermore, they looked so devilish. Then, during the prayer service, some of them who weren't Kohanim went to Duchen. I did not allow it, and they shouted, "Who are you, you old bachelor? You have no respect for older Hasidim. Learn from us how to be a Hasid. You can't even drink any liquor." There's a bunch of drunkens here. But drinking is like a theme in this part of the book. He says, though I was certainly embarrassed by their comments, I nonetheless replied that I would drag away anyone daring to duchen, because the code of Jewish law, Shulchan Aruch, states that a drunk may not duchen. Well, what about also a non-kayin? But anyways, I keep interjecting, by the way. Hopefully, listeners are getting the point. Back to his words. And in case the Hasidim followed a different code of Jewish law, a different Shulchan Aruch, I would go ask the Rebbe. You can just imagine the uproar made by those drunks. How so? They had already spent half a year at the Rebbe's court and did not allow a single day to pass without tikkun. So every new guest visiting the Rebbe had to give money to this group of drunkards to buy liquor, which is called the tikkun.
For those who don't know, tikkun means alcohol.
So now they asked me, where were you when we were busy with the splitting of the Red Sea all night long until wee hours in the morning, until the time of the recital of the morning Shema, just as the Tanaic sages in Bnei recounted the exodus from Egypt the entire night. And you talk about this was the minhag to stay up the whole night and of the seventh night of Pesach. And we also immersed ourselves in the mikveh already, in their clothing. And along comes this misnagid, this overgrown kid, and gives us his opinion. You're about to get trounced. I went right to the Rebbe to at least let him know what was happening and to hear what he had to say about it, because I saw that they could truly give me a beating. I was sorry that I had started the whole thing, because everyone, as you can understand, was on their side. But when they saw that I was running to the Rebbe, they called me back, telling me they would not duchen as long as I did not say anything to the Rebbe. But the Rebbe himself was already aware of what had happened in the shul and sent the Gabbai to tell them not to dare duchen, because the young man was in fact correct. At that, the Musaf prayer service ended, but they continued to drink. He said they had prayed earlier than the scheduled time, since the congregation would assemble about 2 hours later at 10 a.m., while they prayed at 7 or 8. They were the 10 or so permanent Hasidim who stayed in the shul and ate at the Rebbe's table, while leaving their wives and children back in the towns from which they came. They stayed there, drank, and became real drunkards. The exact opposite of the Lubavitcher Hasidim. So you can see that with he liked Lubavitchers and the real that he had for these Hasidim. And then he goes on. I thought that story was really, I think it gives also a taste of him describing life or what it was like. And like you said, there's no filter. He's telling you exactly as it is, as he saw it, in obviously the negative light that he saw this story, but he's giving it exactly as it is.
And he was always up for a fight. He was always up to defend his opinion. He wasn't someone to back down.
No, clearly not. And you could tell. He says at the end he had charata. He regretted that he did it, but it doesn't sound like he did.
That's afterwards.
Yeah, he actually did it. Then he goes on. There's more stories. So, I mean, there's endless stories like this. That's just like 2 pages, and I'm reading your translation that you translated. We'll talk a little bit about your translation shortly, but that, and I think I probably went out of order. I think maybe that comes before he delivered the Esrik to Lieber Rebbe, but that's the point. Then we get to his wedding. He says, "My wedding in a fiery pursuit in 1867, 1868." So perhaps we want to talk about a little bit about his wedding.
His wedding. Is there?
Well, just nothing.
I don't remember anything. It was during a snowstorm, but I don't remember anything particularly. Is there a certain part that you want to?
No, nothing in particular. No, just asking nothing in particular. And then, well, we could nothing in particular. And we can move on to where he talks about In Search of a Livelihood, and that really is important because the title of the book is the Shochet, and his livelihood ends up being a Shochet. How does he get there that he's going to become a Shochet?
Right. So he tries a whole bunch of different things. He tries being a grain dealer, growing watermelons. He even tried becoming a tavern keeper. Here he gave up. He swore off drinking at an early age because he didn't like the drunks he saw around him. So, but he let himself become a tavern keeper. But you can imagine, like when 2 or 3 non-Jews would come in, they'd have a few drinks, they'd start speaking coarsely, and then he'd tell them to leave. And, they didn't like that. And so it'd cause a whole racket. Here they wanted, a tavern keeper to, sit down with them, get chummy with them. And, obviously he was not suited for that. He wanted them to buy their drinks and leave, but not everybody does that. So so to becoming a shochet, he doesn't even, he doesn't talk about any deliberations about the thought of becoming a shochet. He was really well suited to be a shochet. He was honest. He was Yireh Shomayim. He wasn't a businessman. And then he starts the whole process of trying to learn shechita without any money, without where to stay. You had to. The shachtim wanted to be paid for being trained. Training him. He needed money to eat while he's learning. The shechita. He talks about every aspect of shachtim. In not too distant past, for thousands of years, most every Jew had contact with the shochet practically every week. Every shtetl, no matter how, every shtetl had a shochet. Sometimes a shtetl didn't, or a derfel, a village didn't have a rav, but they had a shochet. Because that's like a primary aspect of Jewish life. So we have very few accounts of exactly what it involved. And he tells you every aspect. The sharpening knives, every aspect, especially in volume 2. Here he talks about the whole training, but in volume 2 he talks about his whole day as a shochet and the selling the chalev and the slaughtering for the Muslims, and the Crimea was mainly Muslim Tartars, and so and then he had to pay. He had to get certification, and he had to be tested, and the shachtim wouldn't let him get certified until they paid him.
And he had to pay them.
He had to pay them, yes.
Yeah.
Even though some of the shachtim, there was really only one who really sort of really trained him, but the other shachtim there, since they had permitted it, they wanted to be paid too. So what could he do? They wouldn't sign the certification or whatever unless they were paid.
which really brings us to the part about needing the money, to his uncle, the story of visiting his uncle. And he says that he had a great idea. He says it was with sarcasm, dripping sarcasm. And he starts off the story and he says it's a great idea. And then he goes on a little bit. Then he starts off the story. He says, here begins my account of my horrible trip to visit my uncle. And he's rolling on the ground in hunger. He's starving. And he gets a whole lang of ice. And he ends up, if you want to talk more about this story, to visit his uncle. But this is like where he relays his whole life story with like these side little stories where he goes here and he goes there, and on the way he's hungry, he's starving. He even tells you, you bought, just like give an example. He says to the beginning, and then I'll let you say more about the story. But he just says, I remember buying bread and some green cucumbers, and then going to the train station to buy a ticket I'm going to butcher the name, to Rosdelnia to travel to my uncle Idel. And as you write in your footnote, you're saying maybe those had yellow cucumbers, maybe that's why I said green cucumbers. Like, he's very vivid. The train left at Taraspol at 2:30, and I arrived at Rosalie at 4. I inquired among the inhabitants of the city where they knew where my uncle Idel lived.
His
and provided
memory
his
is amazing.
No, he mamish it and says that he lived 14 versts from there. I asked them directions to his village, which they gave me, and I began walking there. Said it was very hot because it was midsummer, the 10th of Tammuz, but it soon began to cool down. He says his whole thing. He talks about how he's walking, and it was started to cool down, and he was hungry, and he didn't know how long it was, and he started walking, he's hungry, eventually he toes on the floor, he's rolling. It's like a whole really long story. But yeah, if you want to talk more about this bad idea to visit the uncle.
I mean, it's a great story, and that's the point of the book. The book's really, it's just a great read, no matter who you are. But he had this great idea. He heard his uncle became wealthy, so he needed to pay off. In order to get his first shchita position, he had to pay the previous shochet 20 rubles for his moving expenses. So he had to raise that money, and he didn't have it. So I heard one of his uncles became wealthy, so he goes to track him down. And so at one, it's a long story, but at one point, a storm comes, and it's the middle of Tammuz. That's the hottest time of the year, and it's freezing cold, freezing. It's at night, and so he goes to hide. He goes to hide in a haystack. So he carves himself in, and as soon as and this whole flock of ravens, they had been also protecting themselves from the weather in that haystack. And then inside the haystack it's dry, but he's freezing, and he thinks he's going to freeze, and he keeps thinking about his wife. She'll be in Agun, and nobody will find his body. Maybe the ravens will eat up all of him. Nobody will ever find his body. If he died on the open, people could. But here he's in a haystack, and the deliberations are just go on and on. Finally, but what rouses him is the ravens start coming for him. They think maybe he's dead, and they want a good meal. So that gets him scared, and he says, come what may, and he starts running. And he runs, and he runs, and he runs, and he finally makes it to his uncle's village. Not even a village, a hamlet. And his uncle lives in a zemlyanka. It's like a house, it's half under the ground. His uncle once had money. Now he was a poor man. And, that was his great idea. His conclusion is, don't put your trust in people. He put his trust too much in people. And he should have relied on the Eibishter more, on Hashem more.
Yeah, that story, the description in that story are also fantastic.
It's a whole epic journey.
He goes through literally... I've been reading a bunch of selections, but I think it's worth reading a little bit of this, even though you described it. And he talks about the birds quickly calmed down and found a place where they hid from the wind and rain, and I found a place where I covered myself completely. The wind continued to screech and wail, but it had no power over my immediate surroundings or me. The rain also did not reach me, and I lay tucked away in the haystack. My situation seemed good, but then the cold started to penetrate me. It was as if I was trembling from a high fever, for my teeth were rattling, and in general, I did not feel well. I felt that my strength was leaving me. Then I'm going to skip a paragraph. And he says, I began to think of my beloved wife, who had never seen or know the wider world. Should she be left to be a young aguna on top of that? No one knew where I had gone. I did not tell her where I was going, and the haystack in which my body would lie was off on the side some distance from the road. Who knew how long my body would lie around before being buried, or how long it would be before someone would happen upon me? And who knew if the starving birds were not waiting to eat at my body? If so, no one would ever know who had died in this spot and whose bones were lying around. Being unable to remarry, my wife would then be miserable forever. While having this frightening thought, I felt that my strength was leaving me, and I began to say vidui. I cried, but no tears flowed. I spoke, but no words could be heard, since my lips were not moving. But my mind was firm and sharp. I lifted my eyes toward the sky, and I began to bid farewell to it. Though the world had not shined for me, and not during my life, and not during my death, I cast my eyes toward the four corners of the earth and bade farewell to them. Nonetheless, I did not feel like leaving this world so soon and so young. I was only 22 years old and had not left any vestiges of myself. But what does that matter, for when God wants something, it has to be as he wants. I started to doze off again forever. I began to see the horror of death before me. Oh, horrible, horrible, even now when I remind myself of it. Suddenly the raven screeched, which caused me to wake up. I opened my eyes, and I felt like someone being pulled from the jaws of death. I noticed all the ravens jumping toward their roosting sites where I was lying. They apparently thought that I was already dead and would now have prey upon which to gorge themselves. This aroused in me the desire to live. I thought, as long as even one of my limbs can still move, I must save myself. Even if I'm meant to die, God forbid, let me die on the road so that I can be found quickly. And perhaps God will have pity on me, and I'll be able to drag myself to someone's house, even a non-Jews, as long as I'm among my people, so that they will be able to inform my wife what became of me. Then I said to the birds, no, I cannot allow you to eat me alive. I must leave here by any means possible. With those words, I suddenly lifted myself up so that the birds became frightened and scattered, and I ripped myself away, literally, out of the hands of death, and began running with my last bit of strength. I can honestly say that I did not have any strength left, and I myself do not know how or from where that bit of energy appeared. When I think back about this incident, I marvel at where I found the strength to move forward. And it goes on. And he really, like you said before, he really tells you his emotions. It's what's amazing is his descriptions, and also he's just open about his open and raw about his emotions. His memory. It's really unique in all those things when you kind of read the description. And I'm reading your translation, so for readers, you wrote this in Yiddish. This is the translation that I'm reading. So that's really ends with the uncle, and this is really we're towards the end of the volume where he gets the certification and he goes back to Lubavitch. And where does this end? If you wanted to tell us, where does this volume 1? Where does the book end off?
It ends where he got his first Shrita position. He got his first Shrita position. He had just got his certification, and he realized before he starts working as a Shochet, he better run off to Lubavitch again, because he's never going to have another chance. He'll have a full-time job, and it's just not going to work out. So he leaves without telling his wife. And she was pregnant. And chances are, if he had a son, he wouldn't be there for the bris. And he knew that. And at the time, he thought he was doing the greatest thing in the world. He realized it was his fanaticism. Later, obviously, he regretted it. But so he ran off to Lubavitch, and he comes to Lubavitch, and the Marash tells him, go home. He traveled 500 miles, and the Marash, the Rebbe Shmuel, told him, go home. What? So he goes back to where he was staying, and he says, the Rebbe told me to go home. And he goes, no, the Rebbe certainly meant you could stay till Motzei Shabbos. So he let himself be convinced. But the Rebbe saw him in Shabbos and commented to somebody, he's still here? Anyway, the Rebbe said, nonetheless, it will work out well. So after Shabbos, he runs home, races home as fast as he can, and he comes home, and his wife gave birth to a son, and she said, oh, it's a shame you didn't come 3 days earlier, and that was how long he delayed in Lubavitch, 3 days. It's a shame you didn't come 3 days earlier, because a group of men came looking for a shochet to hire from a certain shtetl. So that's why the Rebbe told him to go home. But he decided to go to that shtetl anyway, because wherever that shochet was coming from, that his previous position was open. So he figured maybe he'd get a chance to be a shochet there, and he did. And that's where we end off. Him sort of forewarning that he got the position, but that community, Slobodja, turned out to be extremely trying. So it ends in a cliffhanger.
Yeah, and the reason for the end there is because this is the first 2 volumes of his autobiography, and then there's going to be volume 3 will be the next one. I was going to ask you what makes the work unique, but I think we got that point across to an extent. So, but why did he write the book? Why did he write and publish it? And I also don't think we talked about when he published it either.
You also didn't think what?
I just rolled 2 questions to one. Let's step back. I didn't say when he published it. So let's actually do the second question first. When did he publish the autobiography?
Okay, it was published in 3 parts with the addendum in 1928 and 1929 in Petach Tikva, where he lived. He started writing it in the early 1900s. And he wrote it because he lived in the Crimea. The Crimea was like the frontier of the Tsarist Empire and of the Pale of Settlement. And he saw some of his children had gone off the derech. And he decided to write. There weren't many Orthodox people, Orthodox Jews who wrote autobiographies. Certainly not Hasidic Jews. But he decided to use this relatively new medium to try to convey. He felt that he could convince his children through the hashkacha pratis of his life. They could deduce that there was a God in the world, and once there was a God in the world, the way he thought, everything falls into place. Then the divinity of the Torah, observance of Shabbos, kashrus, etc. So that's what he wanted to do. So he's tracing the hashkacha pratis in his life, and every aspect of his life is b'hashkacha pratis, meaning and specifically that he's an orphan. Now, we're using orphan in the Hebrew sense of the word. In Hebrew, orphan means loss of one parent as a minor. Opposed to in English, orphan means both parents. In Hebrew and Yiddish, it means even one parent. And he felt that, just like it says in Chumash, that Hashem is the father of orphans, that yes, Hashem looked over him and his whole life. Hashem was guarding over him his entire life. And so in that respect, we have an extremely unbiased autobiography. All the maskilic autobiographies, they really have an agenda. They want to show, they have a social agenda. They want to show the fallacies of orthodoxy, a whole agenda, and he has no agenda. He's just tracing the hashkacha pratis in his life, and in that respect, it makes. And he's like a Masiach lefi tumoi, meaning in the course of his narrative, he just mentioned so many details. As we mentioned, so you get a real taste of life. Yeah.
What was the reception of the autobiography like after he published it?
Okay, it wasn't. It was more. It was more printed than published.
Right.
Meaning that they paid a publisher to print it, and then it depended on the family to distribute it. So 100 copies were kept in Eretz Yisrael, 500 were printed altogether. 100 copies were kept in Eretz Yisrael, 400 were sent to had a son in New York who was going to distribute them. So this son, he saw in the Yiddish papers that there was like the big literary critic was Shmuel Niger, Niger, and so he went to him. He went to his office. He goes, "Would you review my father's books?" And he looked it over, and Shmuel Niger found it intriguing. And then I found in archives the son's letters in Yivo. And then the son writes after a couple of weeks, you said you were going to write a review. Anyway, the review came out, and it's very rare for a make or break literary figure to review a privately published book which was unedited. The publisher didn't edit it at all. And so, and he mentioned a lot of these points that we're talking about now. It was, he has the experience of being a literary critic. So he has insight. And we've talked about some of those concepts that he mentions there. You can read more in my introduction. So meanwhile, the son was stuck with 400 copies. He really didn't know what to do with them all. He was not a distributor, but somehow he came across shortly before the book was published. There was a Jewish book review called Block's Jewish Book Review, something like that. And he got in touch with them, and they put it in their catalog, which I think used to come out several times a year, maybe. And it was published in this country for decades. And it was the source for all Jewish books for many decades. So I think he was able to sell them that way, because I did see letters where Pinye-Ber writes that he seems to have sold them all. So what was the reception afterwards?
Yeah.
It's hard to know, though. After Shmuel Niger's article, lengthy review came out, it said you could buy a copy from the son, Pinye-Ber's son. It gave his contact information. Maybe people bought them that way. Maybe Block himself, the review, contacted him that way. In any case, the only other major thing we see in the newspapers is there was a great Yiddish linguist called Yudel Mark, and he, in Yiddish Sprach, he wrote a very lengthy, I think in 1942, he wrote a very lengthy linguistic analysis of Pinye-Ber's memoirs, which all the, those into Yiddish scholarship are familiar with.
Now, what was the translation work for you, translating it? And also the style that you did. You kind of kept the dialect that he spoke of Yiddish and in your translation of the words, the transliteration. So if you can talk about that as well.
Okay. So Pinye-Ber was a master storyteller, but he was not a writer. He was not a professional writer. And though the original Yiddish reads smoothly, and it's enjoyable, and it's geschmack, and anyone nowadays would be envious of having such a rich Yiddish today, nonetheless, the writing style, it's not by a professional writer. Professional writer, it's very easy to translate. He's very clear. And Pinye-Ber, to read it comes naturally, but translating, you have to be very exacting. And it's just not professional. It's not real clear. I had to, read passages many times to understand exactly what he's getting at. So I thought it would get easier over time, but it never did. And it's not like I got used to his style. It's just it just never did. Also, for example, we're talking about the Yiddish from a while ago, So even some basic words don't have the same meaning as today. For example, he uses the word broit. Broit means bread. Bread is bread. But it didn't quite mesh with the context. I looked into it, and I saw that in the Ukraine, broit, the word broit was sometimes used to mean grain. Go figure. So every word, even simple words, had to be examined, thought into. For example, mistame. You're familiar with the word mistame? Probably. It's a word in Lashon Kodesh. It's used in Yiddish. Yet, the way he was using it did not mesh. And then I found some old Yiddish dictionaries, and I see an alternate translation of mistame is certainly the exact opposite. And then it all fell into place. But you have to look in context. When is he using it as probably? When is he using it certainly? In any case, so, and then, just figuring out, I don't know if you want me to elaborate on it, just figuring out the dates in his book is difficult. He writes at the beginning, he's born in 1842, but when he goes to ask for a bracha, and Tzemach Tzedek tells him not to marry until he is 20, and then he decides with the bracha of the three Rebbes that he would only marry right after he turned 19. Well, it's very clear. He's born in 1848. 6 years later. Now, this, in previous generations, before the computer age, before we became so focused on documents, now you go to a doctor, before you even tell him a name, you give the birth date. So, but then people weren't focused like that. It had very little meaning, that exactness and that type of dates. It really did not matter. So, as people, there's been studies, and this is not just Jews, this is a whole variety of cultures. As people got older in their 70s, 80s, they got much older. So a person was 70, they might have thought they're late 70s. And so this is a phenomenon until the modern age. Now people don't really do that anymore. Or maybe in countries where they're not computerized or the like. So that was certainly played a factor in his recording his age as much earlier than it was. But on that 1842 date, making him 6 years older, he based a lot of other dates. In fact, in the first volume, certainly, I think there's only 1 year that's right. One year that he has right. Every other one is off.
So really,
yeah,
a lot of your footnotes is clarifying the years, clarifying everything, pointing out historical.
So this is what I wanted to say. So, but his memory is remarkable because you can go in his book. Once I worked out all the date problem from the age of 5 till he's in his 30s. Till he moves to Crimea, you can go from one Yom Tov to another in perfect chronological order, and it works out. And certain events have been. Historical events certain outside sources have substantiated it. So his memory is outstanding.
So let's just talk about the end of book 1 and then book 2 that's forthcoming. If you want to, we spoke about the end of book 1, but I mean, we spoke about where it ends off. But now, where does book 2, just to tease a little bit, if you want to just mention for the listeners, what is book 2 going to, book 2 of yours, book 3 of him, where it's going to continue on.
I'll mention that in 1 second. I just want to address a question that I didn't address. You asked about his dialect.
Yes. Oh, yes.
So regarding, in Eastern Europe, there were 3 main dialects. Central Yiddish, which is Polish and Hungarian, Lithuanian, which Lubavitchers speak, and the Litvische, and in Yerushalayim, and then there's Ukrainian Yiddish. southeastern Yiddish, and that's what Pinye-Ber spoke, and very few people speak that nowadays, that dialect. And Pinye-Ber spoke a subdialect of that, from that Chersone Gubernia Bessarabia. People call it colloquially Tote Mamalushin, because Tate, meaning father, in that area is pronounced Tote. Mame is pronounced Mome. Mazel is Mozel. And so, anyway, so I tried to incorporate give some local color to the transliteration by including some of this. Not in every case. So when I write the word nu, I don't write ni. When I write shul, I don't write a shil. But I decided to give it some local color. And the glossary, which is in volume 2, I give all the different pronunciations, modern Hebrew, of each word, if it was a Hebrew component of Yiddish, and the Ukrainian Litvish and the like. And the footnotes, I tried to make the book accessible to the layman and the scholar alike. So I do describe every aspect of Judaism, Yiddishkeit that he mentions, but I also have more scholarly footnotes as well. Regarding Volume 2 forthcoming, so this, as I said, Pinye-Ber's book was in 3 parts plus an addendum to part 3. The English translation is being translated into 2 volumes. So Pinye-Ber's volume 1 and 2 are in my volume 1, and his 3 in the addendum are in volume 2, which Mitzvah Shem will be published in September.
And that's going to be the rest of everything.
Yes.
Okay. Just that's basically it. But I just, maybe if you want to end off by saying, as you said, you went with more academic press versus and by the way, it is published by Touro University Press, which is in conjunction with Academic Studies Press, and I'll put a link in the show's notes. But you went with more of an academic press than more of like your standard, quote unquote, from press. And so what would you say to the listener, the potential reader? Who do you think would enjoy the book? I think anyone would, kind of what we're talking about. But who do you what do you want to say to the potential reader here at the end of the podcast?
Yes, really, anyone would enjoy it. That experience has shown that, when people open it up, so many people just can't put it down. But so it's such a compelling read. It's a lesson in betachin, in the belief in Hashgacha Pratis. So in his strive to be besimcha, he tells you how he does it. This is a person who lived in extremely trying times, yet often if he was sad, he would break out in song. And it would cheer him up, and it would cheer up those who were around him. Let's say he was on a wagon, and when he was feeling very down. So it teaches you how a Baal B'tochin lived during that trying time. I would like to mention that perhaps, the book, someone who has very set ideas of what Yiddishkeit is, for someone who thinks that life then was just like it is now, such a person might have a hard time with my book. But by the way, I said at the beginning that the Orthodox Jewish publishers, they wouldn't consider it. But then I submitted it to some regular university presses, meaning large university presses. And the answer I got was, we cannot publish this. So I went to people in the know, and they told me the reason is because although it shows some corruption, it shows no real scandal in the Orthodox Jewish world. Without that, they're not going to touch it. So then I was left, then I started, Touro, who I worked for had already, True University Press, which didn't exist when I started translating this, they had expressed an interest, and I went back to them, and they were wonderful to work with, and didn't ask me to cut out anything. They've just been wonderful.
It's really a fantastic read, so I'm glad that it was published, and it's $25, so it's really affordable as well for the paperback, so it's not super expensive, and it's really something that anyone really enjoys Jewish history, especially autobiography. Primary sources, I've spoken about it a number of times, and as listeners that read a lot of such things are familiar with, diaries and autobiographies, they're really kind of a personal recollection rather than just reading a history book. They're very, especially oftentimes, they're more interesting to read, and there's just a lot of personal experience as you get in this one tenfold more than almost any other one. So it's well worth the read. I'll put a link in the show's notes to this. Also, Rabbi Zvi Nachman wrote a review on the Sfarim Chatter Substack, which I'll put a link to in the show's notes as well if anyone wants to read that if you haven't read it. And so thank you, Michoel, for joining me to discuss Pinye-Ber, Pinkhes-Dov Goldenshteyn, and Volume 1 of the Shochet.
Thank you so much, Nachi. Tzlacha Rabbe.